Hello and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another filled episode. I can't believe that this is our final episode of Season 3. No, it's not our final episode total, but 3 years have already passed since Dallas Pearson and I had launched this show. We hope you have enjoyed it so far. Our episodes are available on either Facebook or YouTube, facebook.com/NorthStarOasis, youtube.com/NorthStarOasis. We do invite you to check out some of our old episodes. But 3 years, it seemed like yesterday. We were just starting our first one, and here we are at the conclusion of Season 3. Next week, we will be resuming with the beginning of Season 4. But as we've been doing the last couple of years now, we're going to go right on over to our Prager University segment. And today, as we take a walk through the year 1775, we're going to do a historical episode today. Who was Paul Revere, and why should you care? Here's Prager University.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Have you ever heard that thrilling line? Do you even know who Paul Revere is? If you're under, say, 30, I'm going to guess that the answer to both of these questions might be no. This is a very serious problem, but it's not your fault. It's a serious problem because it means you've been cut off from one of our greatest American stories. And it's not your fault because no one bothered to teach you about this courageous man and the great American poet who made him famous. It seems professional educators decided that other topics were more important to your education. But they made a mistake, a big one. The story of Paul Revere is part of our heritage. It and countless other stories like it unite us as a distinct people with a shared noble past. They also inspire us and stir national pride. These are good things, vital to the future of the country. Without them, we're just 300 million different individuals living between Canada and Mexico. It wasn't always this way. In fact, not long ago, you couldn't have left high school without memorizing the line I quoted and many of the lines that follow. So let me right a wrong and tell you about two remarkable Americans who lived half a century apart, one a silversmith and one a poet, Paul Revere and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. By 1775, the American colonists and their British masters were on the verge of war. The flashpoint was Boston. It wasn't so much a matter of where the British would strike, but when. To give themselves some advance warning, the rebels created a team of couriers. One of them was a successful 40-year-old silversmith and engraver named Paul Revere. On the night of April 18th, 2 lanterns were lit in the tallest structure in the city, the Old North Church. This was the signal that the fateful moment had arrived. The British were coming. Revere rode out into the darkness to warn his compatriots to prepare for a fight. That fight came the next day in Lexington. The War of American Independence had begun. But in the decades following, history mostly forgot Paul Revere. After serving in the war, he had an extraordinary career as an early industrialist, building a significant business that survives to this day as Revere Copper. But when he died in 1818, his obituary made no mention of his daring ride. The only reason we still know of him is because of another crisis in American history, the Civil War. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow had been an ardent opponent of slavery, an abolitionist, from the time he was a young man. By 1860, he was America's most famous poet. An epic struggle was coming, one that would again determine the future of the nation. He anxiously wondered whether the people of the northern states would be up to the challenge that lay ahead. What might he do to inspire them? Longfellow remembered a story he'd read many years before about Revere's ride. He recreated it with consummate skill. As you read his glorious poem, you can almost hear the thundering hooves of the silversmith's horse. Published in a new magazine called The Atlantic Monthly in January 1861, his brilliant ballad was an immediate success. school children began memorizing and reciting it at annual Independence Day celebrations. In 1883, a 22-year-old sculptor, Cyrus Dallin, was commissioned to create a Paul Revere statue to stand in the plaza across from the Old North Church. It is still one of the most popular tourist sites in Boston. What is Longfellow's poem asking of us who hear it today? It is doing what all great art does. It calls us to think of ourselves as part of something larger, as part of something noble, beautiful, good, and true. The men like Paul Revere who fought in the American Revolution were not merely fighting for themselves and for their families, but for something far beyond that, for a new kind of nation. The men who fought to free the slaves in the Civil War renewed that promise. If we forget these brave men, we forget what they stood for, and therefore we will forget what America means. And just like an individual who's lost his memory no longer knows who he is, a nation or a people that loses its memory no longer knows who they are. Longfellow's poem reminds us. So go read Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I promise you'll be glad you did. It begins like this. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. I'm Eric Metaxas, author of If You Can Keep It, The Forgotten Promise of American Liberty, for Prager University.
Now, I'm honestly not expecting you to go out and start pulling up Paul Revere's Ride on your computer, or if you happen to have it in a book of Longfellow poems on your bookshelf, I'm not expecting you to go out and pick it up. But I do expect that you'll spend a few minutes to actually listen to the poem, because we're going to make sure that you have that information right now. Here is a 12-year-old from Indiana who actually was at the chapel where the lanterns were hung. And she, I think, did an exceptional job in reciting Longfellow's poem. And there's no way I can pass this up in presenting it to you. So here is Brooklyn Sequeira reciting Paul Revere's Ride.
Hi, my name is Brooklyn Sequeira. I live in Indiana. I'm 12 years old, and I'm currently enjoying Patriots Weekend here in Boston, Massachusetts. And right now, I'm in the Old North Church, and I'm going to be reciting Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April, in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1 if by land, and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm." Then he said, "Good night," and with muffled oar he silently rowed to the Charlestown shore. Just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, the British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar, across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile his friend, through alley and street, wonders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms, the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers, marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the Old North Church, by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade. By the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down, a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath in the churchyard lay the dead, in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like sentinels' tread, the watchful night wind as it went, creeping along from tent to tent, and seeming to whisper, "All is well, A moment, only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly, all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay. A line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now he gazed at the landscape far and near. Then, impetuous, stamped the earth, and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with an eager search the belfry tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves in the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hooves in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark struck out by a steed in his flight that flies fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by the steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic, beating the ocean tides. And under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 at the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises when the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of the birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown. And one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest in the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again, under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, a word that shall echo forevermore. For born of the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Thank you.
Now, if you've ever done any type of poetry, memorization, video work, what she accomplished at the age of 12 is tough to do for anybody, including adults who've been around video production for many, many years. I mean, she recited it almost without, almost flawlessly. No edits. And for those of us in video production, you can usually tell when something's spliced. You have to be really, really good if you're going to be able to make it where even video producers can't tell the difference. And yet she had great enunciation and just did a fabulous job. I've looked through a lot of videos for that poem, and I was amazed at how well she had done that. So I have to sing the praises of Brooklyn Sequeira. She did a fabulous job on that, and I hope you have a deeper appreciation for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem and the importance of Paul Revere. Now, of course, that also means that there was something that happened that next day, April 19th, 1775, and that was the Battles of Lexington and Concord. So we're going to take 4 minutes to take a look at what happened there, courtesy of the Civil War Trust.
By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Those words by the American poet and Concord native Ralph Waldo Emerson get to the crux of what took place here on Wednesday morning, April 19th, 1775, when Patriot and militia units returned fire into the British across the bridge that's behind me, triggering the 8-year odyssey that would become the American War of Independence, also known as the American Revolution. Issues like taxation, representation, respect were at the core of the struggle, and nowhere more was that felt than here in Massachusetts. In early April 1775, Governor General Thomas Gage, commander and military governor of Massachusetts, decided he needed to take action to diffuse the hostile relations between the countryside and the city of Boston. At 10 p.m. on April 18, 1775, Colonel Francis Smith and his adjutant, Major John Pitcairn, lead 800 troops west from Boston. Objective conquered. Seize the weapons, seize the munitions, return them to Boston, and put an end to colonial hostility. By 5 o'clock in the morning, they are on the verge of reaching the town of Lexington. But express riders, including Paul Revere and William Dawes, had gotten out ahead of them to spread what became known as the Lexington Alarm, arousing the countryside, raising shot, having bells rung, so that Patriot and militia and Minuteman groups could form and could react to the British presence. 70 Minutemen, under the command of Captain John Parker, gather at Buckman's Tavern in Lexington, adjacent to the Green. At 5:30, they get word that the British are in sight. Parker takes his men out of the tavern, crosses over the Green, lines his men up in 2 rows deep, 70 men total, not blocking the road, merely standing there to show their defiance and their anger and hostility. Parker was not looking for a fight. The fight, rather, came to Parker as the British troops came on, entered the Green, and faced off against Parker and his men. Parker recognized that he was outnumbered, but he did tell his men, stand your ground, don't fire unless fire upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. But a shot rings out, and nobody's sure where that shot came from. And the British instinctively fire a volley. 17 fall, either wounded or killed. By the time the British reach Concord at 9 in the morning, Patriot units, militia units, Minutemen units from towns like Acton, Sudbury, Lincoln, Bedford begin to converge here. They can see the smoke curling from the town of Concord. The British are burning the guns, the carriages that they found. They've cut down the Liberty Pole. They're burning that too. But it looks to the Minutemen that the town is being fired. And it is decided to march on the town and either die defending it or die trying to defend it. At the head of the band of Minutemen that is going to march on the bridge, he turns to Isaac Davis, the 30-year-old popular captain of the Acton Minutemen, and asks Davis if his men are ready to take the lead. Davis says, I haven't a man that's afraid to go. The British initially hold a ridge across the river on the western bank, but as soon as they see the numbers, they know they're outnumbered, and they pull back across the bridge, tearing up planks as they retreat. As the Patriot units near the bridge, a volley breaks out, and Davis and several of his men are hit and fall. Davis, mortally wounded. Shortly thereafter, dies. From the back of the line runs Major John Buttrick of Concord, saying, "For God's sakes, men, fire! For God's sakes, fellow soldiers, fire!" And the Americans unleash a volley into the British. That's the shot heard around the world. British troops fall, and the British flee the bridge in panic, heading back to Concord. But it is going to be one hell of a return march. For the Minutemen, who know the area, have now raced to outflank the British and to meet them along the road that will take them back to Boston. The British are stunned. They're now being fired on by thousands of Minutemen who have converged from 27 towns, and for the next 6 hours, it is a running gunfight between the British and militia and Minuteman units, and nothing has been the same on this planet since. And so began the arduous 8-year journey of the American Revolution and War for Independence.
So that was really the true beginning of the Revolutionary War, or what we now call the American Revolutionary War. What happened after the battles of Lexington and Concord was that there was a major alarm that went out through Massachusetts and Connecticut and really all of the colonies about that British invasion. And British General Thomas Gage had realized that the fort known as Ticonderoga was going to be needing reinforcements. The American colonists also understood that they can't let Ticonderoga get reinforcements. And so just a couple of weeks later, the colonists sounded an alarm, and there was kind of a race to get to Ticonderoga between reinforcing it and capturing it. And what happened was, well, first of all, why was Fort Ticonderoga important? And this is located off of Lake Champlain, New York, over at the Canadian border. And the fort, it was a valuable asset, and there's several reasons. There was a lot of heavy artillery, cannons, howitzers, mortars, and the colonists had a short supply on those types of armaments. And it was also situated, as I mentioned, on the shores of Lake Champlain, which was a strategic, important route between the 13 colonies and the northern provinces of the British Empire, which of course we now would consider as Canada. And the British forces placed there would expose the colonial forces in Boston to a backdoor attack. They could get attacked from the rear if the colonial forces could get attacked in their rear flank if the British could reinforce Fort Ticonderoga and launch an attack on Boston from there. So it was extremely important that that fort would be captured early on. And it was up to Benedict Arnold, before he became a traitor, and Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys to capture Fort Ticonderoga. So let's take a quick look at what happened there. May 9th, 1775.
Here is Ethan Allen. Allen was an officer in the American Revolution and became famous for the capture of the British stronghold of Ticonderoga in 1775. Even though the Declaration of Independence was not signed until 1776, the next year, Great Britain had already been warring against her American colonies. In 1774, she had laid siege to Boston and erected a naval blockade. The battles of Charleston, Breeds or Bunker Hill, and Lexington and Concord followed soon thereafter, all long before the Declaration of Independence was signed. As the conflict spread from Massachusetts onto Virginia and other areas, Connecticut began to fear for her own safety. Connecticut therefore secretly contacted Ethan Allen and requested that he capture Fort Ticonderoga. Even though Ticonderoga was still far away from the scene of any military activity at that time, it was hoped that by this action, the British would be forced to pull troops away from their offensive actions against the Americans in order to defend their own forts. Ethan Allen gathered his Vermont Green Mountain Boys. They surrounded the unsuspecting British and captured the guards. Having secured the perimeter of the fort, Ethan Allen, in his own words, in his own autobiography, told what happened next.
One of the sentries made a pass at one of my officers with a charged bayonet. My first thought was to kill him with my sword, but in an instant, I altered the design and fury of the blow to a cut onto the head, upon which he dropped his gun and asked quarter, which I readily granted him, and demanded of him the place where the commanding officer kept. He showed me a pair of stairs in front of a barrack on the west part of the garrison, which led up to a second story in said barrack, to which I immediately repaired, and ordered the commander, Captain de la Place, to come forth instantly.
Captain! Captain! Come forth now, or sacrifice the garrison.
At which the captain came immediately to the door.
What in the devil is this? Deliver your fort at once, sir, or risk your garrison.
By what authority do you make this command?
In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress.
And with my drawn sword, again demanded an immediate surrender of the garrison, with which he then complied.
In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. It was this phrase and the capture of Fort Ticonderoga which earned Ethan Allen this place in Statuary Hall.
Now, when I said May 9th, 1775, what I was actually referring to was the fact that it was 11:30 p.m. on the night of May 9th when Ethan Allen's forces had actually gathered at Hand's Cove and were ready to cross the lake to the fort. However, it wasn't really until the morning of May 10th, 1775, when the actual assault took place. Just a quick look at the strength and casualties. William Delaplace, he was the commander of Great Britain's 26th Regiment of Foot. That was the militia in place, the army in place. 48 were stationed to Ticonderoga, 9 were at Crown Point, and 21 were at St. John. And all of them were captured. Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen led the Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay Colonies efforts, and they had 83 at Ticonderoga, 50 at Crown Point, and 35 at St. John. One was captured near Fort St. John. One was wounded at Ticonderoga, and that was pretty much the end of that. The artillery pieces were brought over to the American lines in Boston, and it was extremely important to maintain that. And then another battle was fought over Ticonderoga in 1777. Excuse me. One of the things that happened that same day was the convening of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia State House. Today we call it Independence Hall, but at that time it was just the Pennsylvania State House. That's just where the government was operational from. And so 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord, on the same day as Ticonderoga, the Continental Congress reconvenes. Few things of note that from the first Continental Congress, Peyton Randolph was originally reappointed as the president, and Charles Thompson was supposed to serve as the second term as secretary. Randolph, however, was summoned back to Virginia to preside over the House of Burgesses, and he was replaced in the delegation by 32-year-old Thomas Jefferson, who was not a member of the First Continental Congress. South Carolina delegate Henry Middleton was elected to replace Randolph as president, but he had declined, and so it was John Hancock, a Massachusetts delegate, who was then elected to fulfill the position, and it was a position he held until October 31st, 1777. Now, a couple of important things occurred. Actually, in the chronology, I'm off. I can't go that far in advance, but they met. Let's just put it that way. They met starting on May 10th, because then the very next month we had another major battle, and this one was for Breed's Hill, better known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, outside of Boston. And so we're going to take a look at the Battle of Bunker Hill now, and then we'll come back to the milestones that I was going to mention just a moment ago. So here is, from the Civil War Trust, the Revolutionary War in 4 minutes, Bunker Hill.
After the Lexington Alarm of April 19, 1775, 20,000 militiamen and Minutemen groups from across all of New England converged on Massachusetts and Boston in particular. They were outraged, they were angry, and they bottled up the British inside the city. By the middle of June, their numbers had swollen to the point that General Thomas Gage was concerned about their presence outside of the city. They were led by General Artemus Ward, who was head of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, who on the night of June 15th and 16th ordered his forces forward to this position on Breed's Hill, which we erroneously call Bunker's Hill. His men erected a fortification on this hill that in the morning when the British woke up, looked out, were stunned, and knew something had to be done. After a council of war with his subordinates, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, General Thomas Gage made a decision. He was going to attack the American position located on Breed's Hill. And on the afternoon of June 17, 1775, which was an incredibly hot and humid day, thousands of British grenadiers and regulars embarked across Boston Harbor, disembarked on the shores of Charlestown, and began to assault the American positions here at Bunker Hill. Led by the courageous General William Howe, the British marched off in cadence to drum beats and assaulted the American position. Thousands of British grenadiers and regulars massed in formation at the bottom of this hill. Inside the American fort, American militiamen trained their eyes and they knew the big fight was coming. They could see the gleaming bayonets, they could see the red coats. Allegedly, Colonel William Prescott, one of the defenders inside the fort, ordered his men to not fire until they saw the whites of their eyes. The British marched up in cadence, step by step, inch by inch. They got closer and closer and closer, and when they got within musket range, the Americans issued a withering volley that dropped the British in their ranks in their place, and they retreated back to where they started. Once more, the British marched up the hill. Again, this time, stepping over dead and wounded comrades, they made their assault on the American position. And once again, the Americans fired a withering volley into their ranks. The British once more retreated to their original lines. Finally, on a third assault, again marching over their dead and dying comrades, the British were able to penetrate the American forces, and a severe and fierce firefight broke out inside the fortification. Inside the fortification were several African Americans, including Peter Salem, who saw an officer. He drew a bead on the officer, fired his gun, and took down Major John Pitcairn, who had gained infamy during the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Americans broke and ran, but not because they were afraid, but because they had run out of powder and shot. The British won the field, but as Henry Clinton had said, it was a dear-bought victory. After the Battle of Bunker Hill, reconciliation between the American colonies and Great Britain was no longer possible. Benjamin Franklin wrote a friend in England, "We were once friends, we are now enemies." The war had taken a fateful turn.
And that is what happened at Bunker Hill. Now, there were two things that happened with the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, by July, and part of it actually had to deal with Bunker Hill. First was the Olive Branch Petition. I'm not going to read it for you. I'm not going to read either of these for you because they're really, really long. But the Second Continental Congress on July 5th, 1775, had made a final attempt at avoiding that full-scale war between Great Britain and the United States. Or the colonies at that time. Congress had already authorized the invasion of Canada more than a week earlier, but they made a petition to affirm American loyalty to Great Britain. And they had asked King George III to try to help them prevent further conflict. And so it was drafted on July 5th, 1775, and then dispatched over to a couple of couriers in London, and I actually have it here. Yeah, because there were two factions actually inside the Continental Congress, thanks in part to Bunker Hill. One group, led by Pennsylvania delegate John Dickinson, attempted to seek reconciliation through the Olive Branch Petition, and it was the last-ditch attempt to avoid that war. The petition was sent to Richard Penn and Arthur Lee, who were supposed to present it to King George III the following month. However, John Adams had sent a letter to a friend in Europe who had claimed, and in that letter, Adams claimed that the petition had served no purpose and that he believed that war was inevitable. And Adams' letter was intercepted by British officials, and since the letter and the petition had reached England at the same time, the letter was used as partial justification for refusal by the king. This occurred at the same time that the king had received news of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And actually, on August 23rd, he had issued a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. And then in that, he had considered the Continental Congress members as being comprised of dangerous and ill-designing men who were forgetting the allegiance which they owe to the power power that has protected and supported them, and he acknowledged that they had contributed to an obstruction of lawful commerce and, quote, have at length proceeded to open and avowed rebellion by arraying themselves in a hostile manner. And the day after the Olive Branch Petition was adopted and before its transmittal to the British, the Second Continental Congress had also drafted the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. So on one hand, they believe that we can throw an olive branch out, we'll see if the king will take it. The other is, but we don't think he's going to take it. And, excuse me, dry throat today. Sorry about that. In that Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, they had declared, quote, I'm going to read one section of it, but it's a very long document. We are reduced to the alternative of choosing an unconditional submission to the tyranny of irritated ministers or resistance by force. The latter is our choice. We have counted the cost of this contest and find nothing so dreadful as voluntary slavery. Our cause is just, our union is perfect, our internal resources are great, and, if necessary, foreign assistance is undoubtedly attainable. With hearts fortified with these animating reflections, we most solemnly before God and the world declare that, exerting the utmost energy of those powers which our benevolent Creator hath graciously bestowed upon us, the arms we have been compelled by our enemies to assume, we will, in defiance of every hazard, with unabating firmness and perseverance, employ them for the preservation of our liberties, being with one mind resolved to die free men rather than to live as slaves. And that was out of the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. So at this point in time, we're starting to see things turn in the minds of those that we now call the Founding Fathers. At that point in time, the Continental Congress continued their war preparations. And one of the subjects of great debate in that Continental Congress was the establishment of a Navy. Now, a year before, they had authorized a Navy committee, but because they weren't at war with Great Britain yet, and they didn't feel that if they were to start actually creating a Navy, that they would be able to get away with it, and it might bring war closer to them than they really, really wanted, that they held off. But there was a greater urgency starting in August of 1775. There was intelligence that had been received that 2 brigs were dispatched from England on August 11th that were loaded with powder and arms for Quebec, possibly Fort Ticonderoga. And as a result, Congress approved, quote, 2 armed vessels in their service and dispatched the same with sufficient number of people, stores, particularly a number of oars in order, if possible, to intercept 2 brigs and their cargoes. They also gave proper encouragement to the Marines and seamen for the expedition. And that was really the beginning of the creation of the United States Navy. And I actually have to take a look because we are up to a short video about the authorization of the use of naval force.
Today in military history, 1775, the Continental Congress passes a resolution to create the Continental Navy, the precursor to the United States Navy. Congress authorized the purchase of 2 vessels, the Andrew Doria and the Cabot, to be armed against the Royal Navy. The first ships commissioned were the 24-gun frigates USS Alfred and Columbus, as well as the schooners, the Hornet, the Wasp, and the Fly. The Continental Navy successfully harassed British vessels and even scored a few naval victories against the King's warships. But the force was disbanded after the Revolution. In 1798, the young American government would create the Federal Department of the Navy, which we know and love today. Want to know what happened yesterday in military history? Click right here. Want to know what happened tomorrow? Make sure you subscribe.
So that happened on October 13th, 1775. Now, that was, at that point in time, was actually not at that point in time, but, you know, that was the authorization for the Navy, but it wasn't actually the creation and establishment of the Navy. That wouldn't occur for about another 6 weeks. But on November 5th, Congress did appoint Essex Hopkins to serve as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Navy, And with that appointment, they also had appointed Samuel Nicholas to serve as a captain of Marines and Isaac Craig as lieutenant of Marines, and even though it had preceded the formal establishment of the Marines themselves. And so then, 5 days later, it was Friday, November 10th, 1775. Mind you, tomorrow is November 10th, 2017. 242 years later. The last item for business was the following item before the Continental Congress adjourned for the day. Quote, resolved that 2 battalions of Marines be raised, consisting of 1 colonel, 2 lieutenant colonels, 2 majors, and other officers as usual in other regiments, and that they consist of an equal number of privates with other battalions. That particular care be taken that no persons to be appointed to office or insisted into said battalions, but such as are good seamen or so acquainted with maritime affairs as to be able to serve to advantage by sea when required, that they be insisted and commissioned to serve for and during the present war between Great Britain and the Colonies, unless dismissed by order of Congress, that they be distinguished by the names of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of American Marines, and that they be considered as part of the number which the Continental Army before Boston is ordered to consist of. That was it. After that resolution was done, they adjourned. Now, kind of like what happens in the Minnesota state government on the last day of session, they adjourned, and then members of the Congress go on out for drinks. And they walk 4 blocks away to Tun Tavern, which was a very popular drinking establishment at the time. As a matter of fact, Tun Tavern was well known amongst the members of Congress, and Benjamin Franklin in 1756 had actually raised a company of militia at that very establishment. So they went over to have their after session dinner and drinks, and then it was Robert Mullen, the proprietor of the tavern, who was called upon to raise the first recruits of new Marines. Of course, they were joined by the captain of Marines, Samuel Nicholas. And that was when the first recruiting drive for the United States Marine Corps began. Now keep in mind, if you're going to look for Marines, what do you want to do? You want to get able-bodied seamen, according to the Declaration. Tun Tavern is located not too far from the docks. And all of these people who came in for their regular after-work drinks and dinner were all able-bodied seamen. Dock workers, people who actually had more of the tangible qualities that Congress was looking for when they established the Continental Marines. And Mullen had promised them dinner and drinks if they'd sign up for the Continental Marines and do their duty. And so on November 10th, ever since then, has been the birthday of the United States Marine Corps. Now, Edwin Simmons, a historian, he does believe that the actual location might have been a Conestoga wagon establishment because the Nicholas family owned it. However, the fact that Washington, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and other members of Congress knew and frequented Tun Tavern makes that the more likely spot. There is no official record to the initial proceedings for the first recruitment, including the tally of the numbers recruited, but what most likely happened, as I mentioned, is that they were recruiting right after session. Now, Tun Tavern did burn down in 1781. It was never replaced. A commemorative plaque along South Front Street does currently denote the location. We'll show you that in just a second. But unfortunately, it's the location of the original Tun Tavern is at the location of I-95 crossing Penn's Landing today. So you can't actually go and set foot on the land that used to be Tun Tavern. But Marines around the world raise their glasses in fond memory of that Philadelphia watering hole and its historic event every year on November 10th. So right now we're going to take a look. We do have a short video showing the plaque that is at that location on Front Street in Philadelphia.
So we're here in Philadelphia, and this is the notorious spot. Tun's Tavern. here stood Tun Tavern, 1693 to 1781, which is regarded as the traditional birthplace of the United States Marine Corps, authorized by a resolution of the Continental Congress, November 10th, 1775, Semper Fidelis. Nice.
Finally made it, man.
And even when watching that video, you can still hear a lot of the cars off in the distance. And what they've done in Philadelphia, they've actually built a park over the freeway. And they've got a couple of monuments there. So it was actually in that area where the park currently is where the tavern was, except they built a freeway underneath, and you'd have to fill in the freeway to really get back to the original landscape. But that's where the location of Tun Tavern was, and that is what happened on this historic day. So with the 242nd birthday of the United States Marine Corps coming up tomorrow, we are going to play you right now the Commandant of the Marine Corps' 2017 birthday message, and he is joined by the Sergeant Major of the United States Marine Corps.
Every day before I put on these threads, I ask myself one question: am I worthy?
Have I earned the privilege to represent the legacy of all the others who have come before me?
To protect and defend our nation against all who threaten our way of life.
Not only defines our motto,
it's who we are.
Not everyone can be a member of our team.
It takes guts, and it takes courage.
No one said it would be easy.
But anyone who's ever worn our cloth
or received the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor, or heard the cadence, knows our name.
You learn from day one it's about the team. We're part of a team. Anyone I've ever met who's been awarded the Medal of Honor or any of our highest nation's decorations will tell you they did it because they were part of a team. They didn't do it for themselves. They did it because they wanted to make sure everybody came home.
No greater example of that was my own situation on November 13th of 2004. And I think I get way too much credit for that day. The real credit goes out to the Justin Boswoods and the Sergeant Robert J. Mitchells and the Lance Corporal Marquez and Lance Corporal Schaefer at that time. Sergeant Mitchell, he ran across a kill zone in a room that was covered by heavy enemy fire and put himself in harm's way voluntarily to get inside the room with me and try to make a difference and to try to assist in the evacuation of myself and Lance Corporal Nicole. And I think that's pretty incredible.
You know, Marines stepping up to the plate to save other Marines, to make sure they defend freedom and liberty with everything that they got. No different. Uncommon valor, still a common virtue.
75 years ago, the 7th of August, the 1st Marine Division landed on this island. Guadalcanal, unlike a lot of the fights in the Pacific, was a 6-month-long campaign. A series of attacks and counterattacks on air, land, and sea. On the night of 24-25 October, right here, Sergeant John Basselon of Charlie 17, whose position is about 10 meters to my right, defended his position against overwhelming odds.
Well, he earned his Medal of Honor right here.
Correct. Yeah.
Going back and forth through the fire, getting ammo.
That's it.
Issuing it out to his machine gun team.
It happened. Right.
Never thought in my lifetime I'd be standing in the same position with Sergeant John Basselon, led his machine guns, his teams, and he sealed his name in the history of the Marine Corps forever.
The main things I think all of us will never forget is the terrible night bombings and air raids. You can't fight a plane and you can't fight a ship. It was very frustrating because here you had to sit there in a hole in the ground and take all this bounding, and you couldn't fight back. You couldn't fire your rifle at anybody. But the Marines who were on the line on Guadalcanal, I think every man there should have received a medal. And I think every corpsman there should have received a medal.
It's a story about individuals' heroic actions, but it's about leadership, it's about perseverance, about resilience. They could have quit. They could have given up. I mean, there weren't too many good days here. So I think it's important for all of us to remember where we came from and who we are and why we're here on our birthday, which is what we're supposed to do. Remember the past, honor those that are no longer with us, think about what's going on today, and get ready for tomorrow. We've got a great Marine Corps. We've got great Marines. Our families support us. The nation supports us. We just have to execute. And we are executing every day, and the Sergeant Major and I are very proud of what you do. Doesn't mean we can't get better. We don't want to make a mistake to learn. We don't want to lose to learn. We cannot lose if we have to go fight. We got to do what these Marines did here 75 years ago. Persevere against difficult, challenging conditions and odds and win. We've got to win.
And that was the Marine Corps Commandant's message to the Marines for the Marine Corps birthday. We actually do have one more Marine Corps birthday celebration message to bring you, and this comes from the International Space Station.
Greetings, Marines, and happy birthday. I'm Colonel Randy Comrade Bresnik, KSMC retired, flying 250 nautical miles above all of you wherever you're deployed aboard the International Space Station. I'm here on the ISS for a 6-month deployment, and I'm honored to currently serve as the commander of Expedition 53. As a Marine and as an astronaut, I've learned many important lessons along the way about leadership, including the importance of teamwork, humility, and the unwavering pursuit of your goals. It doesn't matter how big your dreams may be or how impossible they may seem, they're yours. And you should never back down or let anyone convince you that they are not achievable. As you celebrate today, pause to reflect on the storied 242-year history of our Marine Corps. Know that we live as a part of the long line of Marines who have served this nation so admirably since the founding of our Corps. I want to thank all of you and your families for their service and sacrifices to our Corps and country. We know so well that our core values of honor, courage, commitment are more than merely words. They are the very foundation of the ethos that is emblazoned on our hearts and souls as Marines. Congratulations on the past year where you have made history, now written forever in the storied history of our Corps. On behalf of all Marines who have gone before you, thank you for upholding our warrior ethos of our Corps and continuing our hallowed traditions. Wherever you are in the world of ours, enjoy your celebration of the birthday of our beloved Marine Corps. Semper Fidelis, and may God continue to bless the United States of America, and the United States Marine Corps. Happy birthday, Marines.
My father was a United States Marine. My stepfather was a United States Marine. My grandfather was a United States Marine. Even though I did not join the Marine Corps, I joined the Air Force instead. November 10th has been an honored tradition in my family, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to present this to you today. So we're going to leave you with the President's Own United States Marine Band. Dallas Pearson, producer. I'm your host, Jeff Williams, wishing all Marines a happy 242nd birthday to the United States Marine Corps, and reminding you there's only 45 more shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.